Ephesians 5 talks about marriage, but in the Greek, there's a clear connection between how it looks to be spirit-filled and your marriage. And I want to talk briefly about that in today's video. So let's talk about that. Now, a few months ago, we looked at the connection, what it meant to be spirit-filled from Ephesians 5:18 onwards. And I wanted to expand on that a little bit today into marriage, because the passage on the family that follows in verse 22 and following from Ephesians 5 is actually flowing out of that same idea. So I want to talk about that very briefly and just give a couple of little pointers from this passage in Ephesians 5 about what it means to be a spirit-filled husband or a spirit-filled wife. Is your marriage spirit-filled? Well, in this video, we're going to find out. Well, maybe we're not going to find out everything in this video, but certainly we'll make some little progressive steps toward that. So let's switch over to the computer and look into this. So here we are in Ephesians 5. You can see we've got verse 18 here. Do not be drunk with wine, in which is asotia, debauchery, wastefulness, however you want to translate that word. Dissipation is typically the way it's translated, but nobody knows what that means. So it's kind of the idea of, something's not being saved, right? It's wastefulness is kind of the idea. It's dissipation. It's just a waste of time and energy. That's the idea. But be filled with the Spirit. That's the next piece here. And then we've talked about this piece here. We have these participles that come all the way through right down into verse 22 here. So we've got participle, 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 and so on all the way through here. And another one there. Just talking about this is what it looks like to be spirit-filled. So here's our main verb, and then we have participles flowing out of that. Okay, so this builds on what we talked about previously, that the finite verb is the main building block of the sentence, and then out of that building block, we have participles in this particular case anyway. And that participle, even though we have a paragraph break here, this is all editorial, right? So we have a participle here, which I think should be just continuation of what's going on here in verse 18. So in other words, this full stop that we have here should not really be there, and this should continue on from previous. But there's a reason why this full stop is here, and why many of the modern Greek texts, and also therefore the translations, end up putting a new paragraph in verse 21 or at the beginning of verse 22, depending on how they see this breaking down. And you can see here, submitting to one another in the fear of Christ. Then what we have here in verse 22 is we have a new subject. So now we have a nominative subject, but notice here we do not have a verb. Wives, to your own husbands, or to their own husbands as to the Lord. Wives, what to their own husbands? Well, the answer to that is this participle is applying not only to everybody who's, subject to this verb up here, but here it's being applied specifically to wives. So in this case, we have wives submitting to their own husbands as to the Lord. So this idea of submission here is simply being extended into the family from the church. So just as being spirit-filled results in us submitting to one another in the church, so too being spirit-filled results in wives submitting to their own husbands in the Lord. And so what does it look like for a wife to be spirit-filled? Well, here's one evidence of a spirit-filled wife, is that she's submitting to her own husband as to the Lord. That doesn't mean then that submission is this horrible thing that nobody wants to do and it therefore becomes this duty. The question here is, well, how do you submit to Christ? If you hold to the lordship of Christ, that Jesus is Lord, and as a believer, He is Lord over your life, then it makes sense as a wife that you're going to you're going to submit to the Lord with joy, and also you're going to submit to your own husband with joy as well. Now, I know that this isn't always easy. Just ask my wife, right? This isn't always easy, and husbands, we are typically the ones who make this particularly challenging. And that's because just as sin has corrupted mankind, so too sin has corrupted man's leadership and man's, ability to love his wife and so on. Anyway, the point here is that the idea here is that this means that a spirit-filled wife is a wife who submits to her own husband. Now, just one note here, and that is we have this little textual emendation. This is a Nestle Alan, and you can see we have this little, looks like a T here. This tells us that there's a variant at this particular point. And if I click on my little button up here and we come down to verse 22, you can see here, here's verse 22. Look at that. In Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and a number of other later texts, a verb is added, they must submit, is added right after this. To their own husbands, they must submit as to the Lord. That means that in these variant readings, we actually have a finite verb that's been added in, which is why many New Testament translations will actually start a new paragraph here, because these texts, and Alexandrinus is a very good text, so is Sinaiticus for that matter. Both of these texts are good texts, and they have this finite verb here, suggesting that this is actually a new sentence. But that is not necessary, and in fact, the oldest texts here do not have it. So for instance, if we go down here, you can see P46, which is a 2nd century text, does not, a 3rd century text rather, is written around about the 200 AD mark. So, maybe 150 years or so before Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, maybe not quite that much, 120, 130 years, somewhere around there anyway. Before Alexandrinus and before Sinaiticus, we have an earlier text that does not have that verb, and it reads the same way this Nestle Aland text here does, without with the participle basically governing wives now as well. So that's the reason why many New Testament translations actually end up putting a break here, because of that added verb later on. And you can see here it's not just those ones, there's these other texts as well, 5th century texts and so on, that also includes this too. So that's some reasoning why. But the point here is that I'm trying to bring across to you is that this participle in verse 21 is actually continuing here in verse 22. So just as it is a mark of being spirit-filled to submit to one another in the church as to Christ in the fear of Christ, so too it is a mark of being spirit-filled for a wife to submit to her own husband. Now, let me just stop for a moment and ask the question, does that mean that husbands get off scot-free and can behave however they want to? Does it really matter then? Does that mean that a husband could require his wife to go and get his slippers when he gets to the door? Oh my goodness, I can't even believe people actually think these things anymore. And honestly, people might not say, yes, that's what it means, but sometimes we behave like that's what it means, and that's just as foolish. So what does a spirit-filled husband look like? Well, I'm glad you asked. Down here in verse 25. Now, in verse 25, we do have a clear break. We have a new finite verb. We have a new segment. Why do we have this new segment here in verse 25 and following? Well, the answer to that is because now that Paul started talking about wives and submission, he's changed his focus from the church to the household. And so rather than just continuing and saying husbands, adding another participle, it doesn't fit anymore to add another participle, so now he has to start, because he's got a new subject with the old participle, now he has to start again with a new subject that corresponds to that previous subject. And so he's talking about wives, so what about husbands? Okay, well, husbands. And so then he goes on to talk about that. But here's the thing. Even though there's not the same clear connection, there's no participle that follows on to that in that stream, still the idea here is that whatever happened previously, Paul's continuing that train of thought. He's just changing his subject from wives, from verse 22, to husbands in verse 25, which means then that what follows here in verse 25 is equally evidences of a spirit-filled husband. So what does a spirit-filled husband look like? Well, let's have a look. A spirit-filled husband loves his wife, right? Husbands love the wives. The wives is literally what it says, but most translators would translate this article here as a pronoun, as your wives. So husbands love your wives. And how are you to do that? What do you mean love your wives? Well, this is actually really interesting. Just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now, this is interesting for two reasons. First of all, it's interesting because Christ loving the church and giving himself up for her is the ultimate example of what it means to love. And there's a reason Paul calls this a mystery here. And I'm not going to do this any justice in this video because we just don't have the time to dig into this. But here's the thing. God loved. So therefore, Christ loved. And out of that love, he thought and decided, what was it that man needs? What is the object of that love, the church? What does the church need? The church needs redemption. The church needs sanctification. And so that's what we see Christ going and achieving here in this passage. He gives himself up for her. Now, for what it's worth too, this is not the first time this phraseology has been used in Ephesians 5. In fact, if we go back to Ephesians 5, verse 2, it says here, "And walk in love, just as also Christ loved us, and handed himself over on behalf of us." And how did he do that? As an offering and a sacrifice to God for a fragrant aroma. This means then that this idea of love is that the husband, or in this case, Christ, gave himself as an offering, as a sacrifice. If we are to follow that line of thinking here in Ephesians 5 verse 25, then what we're saying is that the husband is to sacrifice himself, in a sense, for his wife. Now, not in exactly the same way that Christ did, because I don't believe that's the intention of what he's getting at here. But certainly the idea is a husband should not be self-centered. A husband should be centered around the needs of his wife. Now, again, there's a little bit more here too, because he doesn't stop there. He goes on in verse 26 and asks the question, why? Why would you do this? Look at verse 26. In order that he might sanctify her. In other words, Christ is sanctifying the church, right? The feminine pronoun here corresponds to our feminine noun back here. Having cleansed her, cleansing her with the washing of the water in the word, and we're not going to touch that because that's a whole thing in its own right, in order that he might present to himself. So he might present to himself the church. We have the church again. We have a double accusative here, and the double accusative has both the church and the state of the church, an attribute of the church that the church would have at that point. Glorious. Not having spot or wrinkle, and this is explaining further in further detail what it means to be cleansed, what it means to be holy, and so on, and what it means to be glorious in this sense as well. So he's presenting to himself the church in a state of glory. That is why Christ gave himself on behalf of the church. That's the end point, if you like. This means then that a spirit-filled husband is somebody who is going to be thinking about what the needs of their wife are and how can he make her beautiful, not in a physical sense, but in an absolute sense. Thinking about who this person is before God. How can I make this person the most glorious person that to complete the work, if you like, will continue the work with Christ inside the marriage to help his wife become a glorious saint. That's really the point here. And we have more here because in verse 28 it goes on and says the husband is to love his wife as he loves his own body. Typically husbands care about the way they look. Typically a husband is concerned about what people think, and the way we manage that is we dress a certain way. And so if we're concerned about the way we dress, and of course not all men are equally concerned, or all women for that matter, are equally concerned about the way they are dressed, but nonetheless the point is if you are concerned about that, and there is a sense in which we should be concerned about what people think about us, then we should also be concerned about the state of our wives, in the sense that we're concerned to love them in the same way. And then in verse 33, he says, as themselves. A husband is to love his wife as he loves himself. And of course, the assumption is we do love ourselves. And so the amount of love we have for ourselves is the minimum, I would say, amount of love a husband should demonstrate for his wife. Now, that means then that the role of a husband and the responsibility on a husband as a spirit-filled man is pretty significant, and it's I find this personally a really heavy command, and I certainly don't do this well, and I'm sure that many of you watching this would agree. If you saw my marriage, you'd agree with me, but you probably agree even about yourself as well, right? And so that's the key thing. So yes, submission for a wife is what it means to be spirit-filled, but my goodness, what it means for a husband to be spirit-filled, that's where the rubber really hits the road. That's where things get serious, right? So I just want to encourage you, that's what it means to be spirit-filled. A spirit-filled husband is a man who is going to give up all he can to make his wife the most glorious, if you like, person before God that he can. Now, again, it doesn't necessarily mean they're dressed in finest clothing, they're driving a Lamborghini or anything like that. None of that external stuff really matters. It's what about God? God is concerned about the heart. That's what he's concerned about. And that's what the responsibility, the primary responsibility of a husband is, to work with Christ, because that's what Christ is doing. And if Christ gave himself for that end, and if we are to love our wives like Christ loved the church, then we should also adopt that end. That should be what's important to us as well. So I hope that's helpful. I hope this is encouraging to you. If it is, then hit the like button. Let me know. This is just a little bit of Greek. There's lots here in this text, and I really just want to encourage you, go read some really good books on this. If you're interested in some books on marriage, a couple of good ones are When Sinners Say I Do by Paul Tripp, and then also What Did You Expect by Dave Harvey. And I may have the titles and the authors around the wrong way, but I will put links to those in the description below so you can get a copy of those. Very good books. They are not the only books on this. There's another one, Larry McCall, I think it is, Loving Your Wife, I think is the name of it. It's a good book for husbands, and it talks a little bit about this passage and sort of focuses on this. But if you're interested in those, I'll leave links to those in the description below, so you can go grab a copy. I'd love to hear from you. How do you find this text? What do you find challenging about this? You've heard some of my thoughts on this. I find this really challenging. Let me know in the comments what you think of this as well, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until next time, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. I'll see you then.